What happens when an army built for conquest simply drops its weapons and runs? In the shadows of Belgorod, Vladimir Putin's massive war machine is facing a crisis. It cannot bomb into submission. A mutiny fueled by sheer exhaustion and catastrophic, irreplaceable losses. If you want to understand how this brutal war is collapsing from the inside out, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to see the truth the Kremlin is desperately hiding. On July 3rd, 2026, Vladimir Putin stepped in front of the cameras wearing his military uniform. It was a calculated image. He had not worn this uniform for a major public address since the terrifying days of the Kursk crisis in March 2025. He wanted to project absolute, unbreakable authority. Positioned at a military command post, he stood beside his chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov. Gerasimov delivered the latest updates from the front with the cold detachment of a man reading a carefully edited script. Putin then made a bold declaration. He claimed Russian troops held the strategic initiative along the entire front line. He announced that the Luhansk region was fully secured. He even claimed the strategically vital city of Kostiantynivka had finally been captured. It was a performance designed to reassure a nervous Russian public. But behind this meticulously staged briefing lay a horrifying reality that both men refused to acknowledge. The truth on the ground was not a story of victory, it was a story of rapid, bloody, and irreversible collapse. According to a devastating report from the Daily Express, Russia's total military losses at the Ukrainian fronts have reached a staggering number: 1.4 million men. Let that number sink in. 1.4 million troops put out of action, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The equivalent of entire cities wiped off the map. The situation at the front has become so dire that the highest monthly losses since the very beginning of the war were recorded in June alone. The Daily Express reported that approximately 26,000 Russian soldiers were killed in just 1 month. That is almost 1,000 men a day bleeding into the dirt. Meanwhile, another 14,000 were wounded and forced to withdraw from the battlefield, many of them maimed for life. These are not just routine statistics read from a spreadsheet. This is the slow, agonizing bleeding out of an entire generation. On the Kremlin side, these unprecedented losses are brushed off. They are presented as necessary sacrifices. But the reality on the ground has completely spiraled out of control. Growing, palpable unrest among Russian troops is fundamentally undermining discipline at the front lines. Units that are repeatedly thrown into the most intense combat zones no longer want to participate. They are exhausted. They are broken. They are traumatized beyond the point of caring what their officers threaten to do to them. The command structure has suffered severe, perhaps irreparable damage. The orders come from above, echoing down the chain of command, but the will to follow them is simply gone. The situation has deteriorated so badly that some groups designated for deployment in the Kharkiv region have simply abandoned their weapons. Instead of heading to the front lines to die in another pointless assault, they turned around and fled to Belgorod. They walked through the cold mud, leaving behind expensive military hardware that the Kremlin had boasted about for years, the sheer defiance of turning their backs on. Gerasimov's orders sent shockwaves through the ranks. When they arrived in Belgorod, the military police looked the other way, afraid of confronting soldiers who had nothing left to lose. This is the mutiny. This is the chilling reality Putin does not want the world to see. Soldiers refusing to fight, dropping their rifles in the mud, and running away from a war they no longer believe in. The Russian army is cracking from within. The victory narrative created by the Kremlin is dissolving in the blood-soaked mud of the battlefield. The burden of these shocking losses has pushed the operational capacity of the Russian army to the absolute brink of paralysis. Units that constantly need reinforcements are being filled with poorly trained, barely conscious personnel. These new recruits lack the basic skills to survive on a modern battlefield, let alone fight effectively against a highly motivated enemy. This only accelerates the losses on the battlefield. It is a vicious, inescapable cycle of death and incompetence. The more untrained men you send to the front, the more men you lose. The more men you lose, the more untrained men you have to send. This severe personnel crisis also reveals the hidden, ugly realities behind the occupied territories. Russian troops have failed to establish full control, even in strategic cities like Kostiantynivka, which they proudly and falsely claim to have captured. Reports from the region indicate that large parts of the city have turned into a terrifying gray zone. Neither side fully controls it. Russian infantry is limited to carrying out frantic, desperate raids from the ruins of destroyed buildings. They hide in the rubble, unable to step out into the open without being instantly targeted by a hovering Ukrainian drone. Because the losses are so heavy, Putin's army struggles to hold the settlements it already occupies, let alone conquer new territory. They are trapped in ruins of their own making. Exhausted human resources now bring a new, terrifying risk for the Kremlin. The trained, educated middle class from major cities might finally be dragged into the meat grinder. This demographic erosion has not only crippled the military, but also brought the Russian defense industry to a grinding, screeching halt. Hundreds of thousands of qualified programmers, engineers, and skilled craftsmen have left the country since the start of the war. They packed their bags, took their families, and fled across the border. They took their brains, their innovation, and their expertise with them. Russian factories are facing a severe, crippling labor shortage that gets worse by the day. Their solution is as desperate as it is revealing. They are turning to imported workers from India. It sounds like a bad joke, but it is the harsh reality of the Russian military-industrial complex in the year 2026. The structure that was once promoted as the second most powerful army in the world is being crushed under its own sheer weight in the middle of an asymmetrical conflict it was never designed to fight. The problems linked to troop losses are not limited to just manpower. Frontline soldiers are forced to fight not only against Ukraine's terrifying technological superiority, but also against a total logistical collapse and chronic supply shortages. They do not have enough food to eat. They do not have enough ammunition to fire back. They do not have enough medicine to treat their wounded. The inadequacy of Russian tanks and air defense systems on the battlefield is also driving buyers away on the world market at an alarming rate. Who wants to buy a Russian tank that can be destroyed by a cheap commercial drone? Who wants to buy an advanced air defense system that cannot stop a missile from hitting its most protected targets? This sense of helpless vulnerability has spread far beyond the trenches. It has seeped into the highest levels of Russian society, reaching even Russia's most outspoken war supporters, the Z military bloggers and hardline nationalist commentators. The prominent Russian military analyst Maxim Kalashnikov, for example, openly expressed his deep fear about the threat posed by Ukraine's newly developed ballistic missiles to Russia's domestic regions. Kalashnikov noted with visible distress that systems like the Pantsir and the supposedly fearsome S-400 might be completely ineffective against this new generation of missiles. He issued serious warnings about catastrophic developments expected in the coming autumn in the rear areas of Russia. As Kalashnikov himself reluctantly admitted, Russia's advanced S-400 systems currently protect only three things of value: the Kremlin complex in Moscow, the presidential residence in Valdai, and the Crimean Bridge. The rest of Russia's vast territory has been left virtually undefended against Ukrainian missiles. If you live outside those three protected zones, you are entirely on your own. The state cannot protect you. Your life is secondary to the survival of the regime. Former Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Kasyanov also spoke out about this glaring vulnerability. He stated plainly that an army claiming to conquer Europe cannot even protect its own capital, and that the elites feel deep shame about the situation. Even Russian elites and propagandists now recognize behind closed doors that Ukraine's growing long-range strike capabilities cannot be stopped. While Moscow claims it has the initiative at the front lines, huge oil refineries, massive ammunition depots, and crucial logistical hubs are being systematically destroyed one by one in the background. The Russian army finds itself trapped in an impossible dilemma, caught between trying to occupy hostile territory and simply trying to maintain its own structural integrity against Ukraine's unyielding attrition strategy. Before we dive deeper into the technological revolution that is making all of this possible, I want to ask you a quick favor. If you are blown away by the scale of these events, take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me which piece of Ukrainian tech surprised you the most. Your interaction pushes this video to more people who need to see it. So, how exactly has Ukraine managed to keep a numerically vastly superior force under such relentless pressure? The answer lies in a profound strategic shift. It lies in Kiev's bold decision to abandon traditional military doctrines and fully embrace an asymmetrical, technology-driven strategy. They stopped trying to fight the Russian army the way the Russian army wanted to be fought. They changed the rules of the game entirely. The most striking example of this revolutionary approach has been a sustained drone operation that has reshaped the very nature of this conflict. The Ukrainian armed forces launched a highly secret, meticulously planned two-phase operation with the codename Operation Web to fundamentally disrupt the balance of power at the front and deep inside Russia. The first phase began in May 2025 and continues to wreak havoc to this day. It focused intensely on hunting down armored vehicles and severing logistical supply lines deep inside Russian territory. The operation was so shockingly successful that Russia's planned large-scale mechanized offensive had to be postponed for a full 6 months. 6 entire months of strategic paralysis. The Ukrainian Minister of Defense, Mikhailo Fedorov, personally announced that about 800 Russian armored units were destroyed in just the first 3 nights of Operation Web. Just try to imagine the sheer panic on the Russian side. Hundreds of modern tanks and armored vehicles turned into burning heaps of scrap metal before they could even reach the front lines. Russian tank crews woke up in their camps deep behind the lines, thinking they were safe, only to have the roof of their armored personnel carriers torn open by a silent descending drone. Entire columns wiped out in the dead of night by machines they couldn't see or escape. The shockwaves through the Russian high command were immense when they realized their entire strategic calendar was ruined. In June 2026, the second phase, named Operation Artweb, was launched with devastating precision. This time, the focus shifted directly and aggressively to Russian artillery systems, the backbone of the Russian war machine. Coordinated attacks in critical sectors in Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, and Donetsk eliminated a total of 1,180 Russian targets. The operation proved devastatingly effective. On the very first day, the combat activity of Russian units in some areas dropped by a staggering 81%. The guns went completely silent. The Russian artillery crews were simply too terrified to fire their cannons, knowing that a vengeful drone would find them the exact moment they revealed their position. The hunters had become the hunted. Ukraine's surprises did not end there. Recent large-scale attacks revealed the true, terrifying scale of what had been hidden from the public eye. In a single night, 660 Ukrainian drones took to the skies, heading toward critical facilities in various regions of the Russian heartland. Refineries near Moscow, vital energy infrastructure in Crimea, and strategic military communication centers were all struck simultaneously by this massive swarm. The attack on the Kapotnya oil refinery in Moscow forced the complete suspension of flights at the capital's 4 international airports. The skies over Moscow went quiet, not because of a victory parade, but because of paralyzing fear. These attacks on strategic facilities became so intense that the Russian Ministry of Defense was forced to report that in just one night, 992 unmanned aerial vehicles were launched against their territory. Nearly 1,000 drones in the sky at once, overwhelming every defense system available. The attack on the Tuapse refinery on the Black Sea coast not only halted production entirely, but also caused a massive oil leak that heavily polluted the shores of the resort town of Sochi. While local authorities tried desperately to downplay the severity of the leak, volunteers spent months cleaning the toxic sludge from the beaches. Russian air defense systems were virtually helpless against these simultaneous, multi-directional attacks that completely saturated their radar screens, consecutive attacks, and severed. Supply lines plunged the Crimean Peninsula into widespread darkness and a severe fuel crisis. Damage to oil terminals and crucial ferry crossings in Kerch effectively turned Crimea into an isolated island, cutting off its main supply arteries. The once mighty Crimean bridge was no longer enough to sustain the peninsula. The sea was no longer safe. The land routes were constantly on fire. While Russia failed time and again to effectively respond to this air operation, Ukraine showed the entire world how unmanned systems are rewriting the fundamental rules of warfare. Kiev's successes are not only made possible by the sheer courage of its soldiers, but by a perfectly functioning, highly innovative technological revolution operating behind the scenes. The Ukrainian military has effectively transformed its defense industry into a massive, agile laboratory that produces autonomous systems capable of operating under all conditions, on land, in the air, and at sea. According to extensive reports, Ukraine has built a new military technology ecosystem where systems can fly, crawl over rugged terrain, swim across water, and reconfigure themselves according to the immediate demands of the battlefield. A new generation of FPV drones equipped with specialized armor-piercing warheads are specifically designed to hit Russian tanks at their weakest points. A new Ukrainian drone can even pierce the 50mm cage armor. That was supposed to be the ultimate protection for Russian tanks. To counter Russian electronic warfare, fiber-optic guided drones have been deployed in massive numbers. These drones are connected to the operator by a thin wire. They cannot be jammed, they cannot be spoofed, they cannot be stopped by any electronic interference. They will find their target no matter what. A brilliant digital platform called Drone Builder allows frontline units to order custom drones built from modular components and receive them in a matter of days. This drastically shortens the time between identifying a tactical problem on the battlefield and deploying the exact weapon needed to solve it. A soldier sees a problem, orders a specific drone tailored to fix it, and gets it in days. That is lightning-fast innovation. Unmanned ground vehicles designed for the evacuation of wounded soldiers and logistical supply have been successfully tested and approved in European countries like Denmark. These robotic vehicles save countless lives by driving through heavy artillery fire, where human medics would surely perish. Although the humanoid robot prototype known as Ghost Mk1 experienced some balance problems during its initial tests at the front, Ukrainian engineers continue to develop and improve it relentlessly. On the sea, autonomous maritime drones like the Blue Dragon have been developed to protect Odessa and have fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the Black Sea, pushing the Russian Navy further away. Jointly developed European radar seeker heads, despite being incredibly small, can accurately track and lock onto targets, even in the pitch black of night. Technology developed by Destinus, and integrated into the Hornet Block 2 interception system, can detect incoming attack drones from up to 150 kilometers away, giving defenders crucial time to react. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky directly referred to this massive technological leap in a striking statement about Ukrainian weapons. He declared with absolute confidence that Ukraine has reached a level of high-tech weapons production that will surpass Russia's capacity in the long term. The €90 billion credit approved by the European Council, along with an additional multi-billion euro financing package in the pipeline, is seen as the strongest guarantee that this production increase will continue without interruption. The future deployment of artificial intelligence-supported autonomous systems could significantly worsen the logistical nightmare the Russian army is already facing on a daily basis. If Ukraine maintains this torrid production pace, Putin's exhausted troops will not only struggle to find enough manpower to hold the line, but they will also have to confront an invisible, unrelenting, and completely tireless machine army that does not sleep, does not eat, and does not feel fear. We are past the halfway point of this deep dive, and the reality is staggering. Your support is the engine that keeps this channel running. If you believe the world needs to hear these unfiltered stories, please take a second to subscribe, like this video, and share it with your community. Let's make sure the truth reaches every corner of the internet. Faced with this grim prospect, does the Kremlin still have a strategic move left that can reverse the situation, or are they simply out of options? Russia's increasingly limited choices have led Putin to involve his closest ally, Belarus, in a very dangerous and desperate game. The long closed-door meeting between Putin and Alexander Lukashenko at the Valdai residence in June is one of the clearest signs of this creeping desperation. The meeting produced no signed documents and was kept entirely away from the press. It brings back dark memories of historical loyalty tests in Moscow, like those with Lavrenti Beria and Yevgeny Prigozhin, men who were summoned to quiet rooms and whose fates were sealed behind those closed doors. Putin probably felt forced to take this drastic step. Russia desperately needs Belarus's refineries, railways, and strategic geographic location to compensate for the devastating damage Ukraine has inflicted on Russian energy and logistical infrastructure. The Belarusian refineries in Polotsk, Novopolotsk, and Mozir now serve as the absolute last bastion keeping Russia's rapidly dwindling gasoline supplies alive. Russia's domestic fuel production collapsed by a staggering 25% in June alone as a direct result of unrelenting Ukrainian drone strikes. But Lukashenko is almost certainly acutely aware that turning his country into a direct participant in this brutal war would be absolute political suicide for his regime. The Belarusian people have no appetite for this, or war. Even Russian nationalist commentators recognize this harsh reality and openly state that Moscow cannot protect important facilities within its own borders, let alone defend Belarusian assets. Moreover, if Belarus becomes a military launchpad for Russian attacks, long-range missile attacks by Ukraine on strategic targets in the Belarusian capital of Minsk would become an absolute certainty. The Zelensky government has already made it crystal clear that signal relay stations in Belarus are being used to guide Russian drones into Ukrainian territory, and such hostile actions will not go unanswered. This entire reckless maneuver risks jeopardizing Russia's last remaining logistical and fuel lifeline instead of offering any meaningful new advantage on the battlefield. In fact, it looks exactly like the desperate final move of a defeated chess player who is willing to expose his most valuable piece in a last-ditch attempt to avoid checkmate. Meanwhile, the lethal combination of massive, unsustainable losses at the front and the ever-deepening economic collapse within Russia is creating the perfect conditions for a catastrophic storm. Russian elites and the general public, once thoroughly convinced of the Kremlin's invincibility, have seen their confidence in Putin drop to historic lows. Economic indicators have deteriorated so badly that the official statistics bureau, Rosstat, has completely stopped publishing fuel price bulletins just to hide embarrassing price hikes from the public. If the Russian people saw the real numbers at the gas pump, the social outrage would be uncontrollable. Interest rates remain crushingly high for businesses, suffocating any chance of economic growth. Even ordinary Chinese vehicles imported through unofficial parallel channels are being sold at 50% above standard European prices, pricing the middle class out of basic transportation. The civil aviation sector is resorting to literally cannibalizing Airbus and Boeing planes for spare parts due to heavy international sanctions. They are taking apart one commercial jet just to keep another one flying. The humiliation of a superpower that cannot even keep its own domestic flights running without tearing apart other planes is staggering. The most acute and painful shortage across the country remains fuel. Russia sits on some of the largest oil reserves in the world, yet its citizens are lining up for gasoline rations. Gasoline shortages at gas stations, rapidly rising inflation on basic food and goods, And an economy heavily constrained by sanctions placed the full burden of the war directly on the shoulders of ordinary Russian citizens. Increased oil production by global partners and the easing of tensions over Iran have pushed global oil prices down to the $50 per barrel range, putting further pressure on the Russian state budget. Putin's war machine desperately needs high oil prices to survive, and the rest of the world is simply not giving him that. Putin continues to search frantically for new and extreme ways to limit the staggering losses within his army, searching for a magic bullet that does not exist. This desperate search could lead to very extreme measures in the near future. Rumors of a new, large-scale mobilization expected in October 2026 are already sparking intense fear and burning anger throughout Russian society. Mothers and wives are starting to realize the official letters they receive are nothing but lies. One of the most absurd examples of this state censorship occurred when local newspapers in St. Petersburg published front-page headlines reading, "A beautiful sunset," while attack drones bombarded the city and toxic smoke filled the skies. The government would rather lie about a drone attack than admit it cannot protect its own citizens. Luxury yachts closely linked to Putin and his inner circle have also suddenly left Russian waters and headed toward the safety of Turkish ports. Both the 71-meter-long Victoria and the massive 82-meter-long Graceful made the journey to Turkey in the exact same time period, slipping away in the night. The emerging picture becomes clearer and more ominous by the day. Historically, wars that Russia has lost, such as the Crimean War and the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, have always led directly to deep, destabilizing regime changes in Moscow. The pattern is etched deeply in history. If Ukraine maintains the pressure and the Russian army continues to lose thousands of soldiers every single month, the leader of the Kremlin will face extremely difficult and dark days ahead. The threat will come not only from the front lines, where his army is melting away, but also from within the very corridors of power in Moscow, where the elites are growing restless. In the end, Putin's proud, defiant posture in his military uniform before the cameras is no longer enough to hide the horrific reality on the ground. We are witnessing a Russian war machine whose industrial productivity is rapidly collapsing, whose logistical lines are hopelessly fragmented, whose economy cannot sustain its own population, and which is being crushed under relentless technological pressure from a smaller, smarter enemy. The new, terrifying chapter of warfare written by Ukraine through modern asymmetrical doctrines shows everyone how these new doctrines can make the cumbersome, rigid structures of massive conventional armies completely obsolete. The old ways of war, where millions of men march across borders relying on sheer mass, are gone forever. The future belongs to the fast, the smart, and the autonomous. What are your thoughts on this situation? Can a leader who loses the support of his own domestic elites escape being crushed between the gears of the very war machine he created? The mutiny in Belgorod is not just a minor military event. It is a glaring symptom of a dying system. It is the sound of an army breaking apart from the inside. The truth is marching forward, and no amount of propaganda can stop it now. The cracks in the foundation are too deep. The losses are too great. The technology is too advanced. The world is watching an empire bleed out, and the soldiers in Belgorod are just the first to openly walk away from the slaughter. When the army refuses to fight, the war is already over.